What if I told you that the price of a single mistake could be measured not in gold, but in centuries of oblivion? We are accustomed to viewing the Age of Discovery as a parade of triumphs, where brave captains conquered new horizons and brought back spices. But behind every successful return to Lisbon, dozens of ships disappeared forever into the sea foam. The story of the galleon San Juan is not a tale of heroic battles or great discoveries of new lands. It is a chronicle of the slow, painful demise of the richest expedition of its time, which faced an enemy that could not be defeated with cannons or swords. In 1552, the Portuguese Empire was at the height of its power, controlling trade routes from Brazil to Japan. The galleon San Juan was the jewel of this fleet, a floating palace laden with riches whose value exceeded the budgets of some European kingdoms. On board were the cream of society, confident in their invulnerability and their right to rule over the elements. None of them could have imagined that in a few weeks, gold would become a useless metal and titles would lose all meaning in the face of the merciless African wilderness. Watch the video to the end to find out how one fateful decision by the captain, dictated by nobility rather than logic, doomed 500 people to death and erased the line between the elite and the slaves. What if I told you that everything you believed about the safety of sea travel at that time was untrue? The galleon San Juan left the Indian port of Cochin not just as a merchant ship, but as a symbol of Portugal's absolute power. The ship's holds were bursting with Chinese porcelain, precious stones, and most importantly, black pepper, a currency that was valued at the weight of gold in Europe. The greed of the merchants and officers was so great that the cargo was even placed where the cannons and fresh water supplies were supposed to be. Captain Manuel de Sousa Sepulveda, an experienced nobleman, was bringing home his young wife Leonor and his entire fortune, accumulated over years of service in India. The ship resembled an overcrowded floating city where every inch of space was occupied either by goods or people. There were more than 600 people on board, the crew, soldiers, wealthy passengers, and hundreds of slaves serving them. This floating hierarchy seemed unshakable, as if the king himself had established these rules for all eternity. However, the ship's overload was a critical violation of all maritime laws, which everyone knew about but kept quiet for the sake of profit. The ship's draft was so deep that the lower gun ports had to be sealed shut, depriving the crew of the ability to ventilate the holds. In the stifling darkness below, among the bales of spices, the process of decay had already begun. But above, on the sun-drenched deck, there was an atmosphere of celebration and anticipation of imminent wealth. No one wanted to think about the fact that the extra tons of cargo made the ship unwieldy and vulnerable to any serious disturbance. Engineers of the time warned that the galleons were not designed for such loads, but the voice of reason was drowned out by the clink of coins. Every barrel of pepper, every vase of the Ming dynasty was insured only by the hope for luck and the skill of the navigator. People believed that the imperial flag on the mast could ward off storms and that prayers would protect them from underwater reefs. It was a collective illusion of safety, bought with enormous sums of money. The social structure on the ship strictly mirrored Lisbon society. The nobles dined on silver while the sailors slept huddled together on wet planks. But the sea is an environment where social status does not add buoyancy, and gold sinks faster than stone. The seeds of future disaster were already sown in this closed ecosystem, sprouting from human greed and pride. No one noticed the warning signs, the creaking of overloaded frames and the sluggish response of the rudder to the helmsman's commands. As they rounded the Cape of Good Hope, the weather began to change, as if nature itself had decided to test the strength of this ark of vanity. The wind picked up, and huge waves began to toss the overloaded ship around like a twig. It was at this moment that it became clear that the overload was not just an inconvenience, but a death sentence signed back at the port of departure. The captain tried to maneuver, but the inertia of thousands of tons of cargo made the galleon unresponsive and sluggish. The sailors, who understood the sea better than their masters, were the first to sense the impending disaster, but discipline forbade them to question orders. The officers continued to believe in the strength of the hull, ignoring the fact that wood has a fatigue limit. It was a clash between human greed and the physical laws of the universe, and the outcome of such a battle is always a foregone conclusion. The irony of fate was that the very wealth they were so eager to bring home would be the main cause of their demise. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. Do you think greed is an inevitable companion of progress, or is it a vice that can be eradicated? Write about it in the comments, and be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss stories that change your view of the past. Are you ready for the shocking truth about how quickly civilization can disappear? The storm off the coast of present-day South Africa was not just bad weather. It was a hammer that smashed the San Juan against the coastal rocks. The waves were so powerful that the ship's hull, which seemed indestructible, cracked like a nutshell. In a single second, the luxurious cabins turned into death traps, and the precious cargo became deadly ballast. The panic that gripped hundreds of people was worse than the elements themselves. In the struggle for lifeboats, ranks and titles were forgotten. The water that poured into the holds mixed pepper with sea salt, creating a caustic slurry in which those who did not manage to get out were drowning. People jumped into the boiling foam of the surf, trying to grab hold of the wreckage of masts and barrels. The shore, which seemed like salvation, greeted them with sharp rocks and a cold wind that chilled them to the bone. Of the 600 people, just over 500 made it to solid ground, many of them wounded and completely exhausted. The majestic galleon, the pride of the fleet, lay on its side, and the waves methodically ground its skeleton, throwing wet silks and broken porcelain onto the sand. It was a surreal sight, a beach strewn with treasures that no longer had any value. The survivors looked out at the ocean, realizing that their world had collapsed and that completely different laws now applied. The first hours on shore were spent in shock and attempts to comprehend the scale of the disaster. Captain Manuel de Souza, who had lost control of the ship, tried to regain control of the people, but his authority faltered along with the galleon's mass. The nobles, accustomed to comfort, stood in wet clothes, shivering from the cold, and looked with horror at the wild jungle that began just beyond the surf. The slaves and sailors, more accustomed to physical hardship, were the first to start looking for fresh water and shelter. A makeshift camp sprang up on the shore, built from the wreckage of the ship and sailcloth washed up by the sea. Here, amid the ruins of former glory, the people were confronted for the first time with the reality of their situation. They were alone at the edge of the world. There was no help to be expected, for no one in Portugal even knew what had happened to them. Their fate now depended solely on themselves, on their ability to make tough decisions. The remaining provisions that had been saved were negligible for such a large crowd of people. The rice was soaked in salt water, the crackers had turned to mush, and the wine barrels had been smashed on the rocks. The first quiet but frightening inventory of resources began, revealing that starvation would set in within a few days. This discovery was the first blow to the morale of the survivors, who had not yet recovered from the horror of the shipwreck. A quiet panic began to brew among the survivors, which was still held back by the remnants of discipline and hope for the captain. But every glance at the raging ocean reminded them that the way back was cut off forever. The only way forward lay through unknown lands full of dangers they had only read about in scary stories. This land was beautiful in its wild, primitive beauty, but completely indifferent to the fate of strangers. Here, on this beach, the story of the sea expedition ended, and the story of survival on land began. The gap between their past lives and the present moment was enormous, and not everyone was able to overcome it. It was a moment of truth when masks were dropped and everyone was left alone with their true selves. But the worst was yet to come. What if I told you that the decision made on this shore would prove more devastating than the storm itself? What if everything you had been taught became obsolete in an instant? Captain de Souza convened a council to decide whether to wait for help on the spot or walk to the nearest Portuguese outpost in Mozambique. The maps of the time were inaccurate, and no one had any idea of the actual distance they would have to cover. They thought they could reach safety in a couple of weeks, but in reality it was hundreds and hundreds of kilometers across rough terrain. The decision to walk was made, and this was the beginning of the end for most of the participants in the expedition. A huge column of men, women, slaves, and nobles stretched along the coast, resembling a funeral procession. They carried with them the remains of their weapons, a little food, and those valuables they could not part with, naively believing that they would be useful on the journey. It was an absurd picture. People in velvet and silk, wandering through the sand under the scorching African sun. From the very first days, it became clear that they were completely unprepared for such a journey. Their European shoes fell apart on the rocky paths, and their heavy clothing made every movement torture. They walked along the shore, hoping to see a sail, but the horizon remained clear and empty. Every kilometer they walked took away strength that couldn't be restored with their meager rations. Soon the first casualties began. The weak and wounded could not keep up and began to fall behind. At first they tried to carry them, constructing primitive stretchers from spears and cloth. But as fatigue set in, compassion gave way to the pragmatism of survival. Those who fell and could not get up were left behind, given a wooden cross as a final consolation. The landscape changed constantly. Sandy beaches gave way to steep cliffs that had to be climbed over, risking falling down. Rivers flowing into the ocean became insurmountable obstacles, forcing people to build rafts or look for fords in crocodile-infested waters. Every day, nature threw up new challenges, testing people's determination to reach their goal. The hope that had driven them in the early days began to give way to despair and deep irritation. People began to realize that the maps in their heads did not correspond to the reality beneath their feet. The distances turned out to be enormous, and the neighboring port was an unattainable dream, a mirage in the desert. But to stop meant death, so they continued on, turning into mechanical puppets. The captain tried to maintain order, but his orders sounded less and less convincing. He walked alongside his wife, who maintained her dignity despite the hardships. Her presence was a symbol that they were still civilized people, not a herd of hunted animals. But even this symbol was beginning to fade under a layer of dust and dirt. It was not a march toward life, but away from death, which breathed down their necks. Every morning began with the column becoming a few people shorter. The jungle and the ocean silently watched this slow, tragic parade. If you enjoy learning about such incredible historical events, please like this video. It will help us create more content for you. Are you ready to learn the truth about what people are capable of doing for food? The provisions taken from the ship ran out alarmingly quickly, and hunger became a constant companion for the travelers. At first, people tried to hunt or fish, but they had neither the skills nor the appropriate equipment for the local conditions. What they managed to catch was a drop in the ocean for 500 hungry mouths. People began to eat anything that even remotely resembled food. Unknown berries, roots, seaweed washed ashore. Often such food led to severe poisoning, which became fatal in conditions of dehydration. Leather belts, shoes, and even the covers of rescued books were boiled for hours in an attempt to soften them. Hunger changed people not only physically, turning them into living skeletons covered with skin. It changed their psyche, erasing moral prohibitions and social norms that had seemed unshakable. Fights over dead fish or crabs found on the shore became commonplace, in which a nobleman could clash with a sailor. Water was an even bigger problem than food, especially when the route passed through salt marshes or dry coastal areas. People drank from dirty puddles, risking fever, just to quench the burning fire in their throats for a second. Some desperately tried to drink seawater, which only hastened their end, leading to madness and agonizing death. Deprived of nourishment, the body began to consume itself, drawing energy from muscles and organs. People walked in a semi-delirious state, seeing hallucinations, tables laden with food, fountains of wine, rescue ships on the horizon. Reality mingled with delirium, and it became impossible to distinguish one from the other. Those who still retained their sanity tried to chew tree bark or suck moisture from plant stems. It was a daily, minute-by-minute struggle with their own bodies, which demanded that they stop and give up. but the instinct for self-preservation drove them forward, forcing them to take one step after another. People's eyes became empty and indifferent, the spark of hope and interest in life extinguished. They became shadows of themselves, moving by inertia toward a goal they hardly remembered. Hunger made everyone equal, rich and poor, strong and weak. The lack of food revealed the true value of gold and jewels. They could not be eaten. A bag of diamonds was not worth a crust of bread in this cursed place. It was a cruel lesson in survival economics, which they learned too late. Read on to find out how relationships between people change when the last crumbs of humanity disappear. As they moved north, the social structure of the expedition began to rapidly disintegrate. The former titles and ranks that had carried so much weight on the deck of the galleon meant nothing here. The slaves, who were more accustomed to hard physical labor in the local climate, suddenly found themselves in a more advantageous position than their pampered masters. Conflicts began over the distribution of remaining resources and responsibilities in the camp. The nobles demanded that they continue to be served, but the servants, realizing the hopelessness of the situation, increasingly refused to obey. The captain's authority hung by a thread, and only the presence of weapons among his entourage maintained the appearance of order. People began to form small groups based on interests or family ties, isolating themselves from the rest. Within this great tragedy, dozens of small dramas were playing out: betrayals, thefts, secret alliances. The solidarity that had existed at the beginning of the journey gave way to suspicion and selfishness. It was especially hard for women and those who were not used to long journeys. Leonore de Sa, the captain's wife, was holding on with her last ounce of strength, but her physical condition was deteriorating day by day. The men who had previously sworn eternal loyalty and protection now looked away, unable to help. One day, the group decided to get rid of the extra weight that was slowing them down. Expensive doublets, silverware, and chests with personal belongings were left lying on the sand. It was a symbolic farewell to the past, an acknowledgement that there would be no return to their former lives. Their moral foundations crumbled as quickly as their physical strength. What had once seemed unthinkable, leaving a comrade to die or stealing his last sip of water, became the norm. Humanity became a luxury they could no longer afford. Fear of the unknown and the constant threat of attack by wild animals or local tribes made people nervous and aggressive. Nights by the campfire were spent in oppressive silence, broken only by the moans of the sick and the sounds of the night savannah. No one made plans for the future anymore. Everyone lived with only one goal: to survive until dawn. Captain de Souza tried to maintain what remained of his dignity, but his orders were increasingly ignored or carried out with open discontent. He saw his authority slipping through his fingers like dry sand. It was the agony not only of the people, but of the very idea of society. The collapse was complete and irreversible. They had become a pack driven only by fear and hunger. But even in this state, they did not yet know that the ultimate betrayal lay ahead. What if I showed you the moment when civilization lost to barbarism because of naivety? After weeks of exhausting marching, the Portuguese encountered a local tribe whose ruler promised them help and guides. However, the condition was harsh. The foreigners had to surrender all their weapons as a sign of peaceful intentions and trust. Captain de Souza was faced with a difficult choice: keep their muskets and swords and risk fighting superior forces, or trust the promises and disarm. His advisors were divided in their opinions, but fatigue and the desire to believe in the best prevailed. The captain, raised on a code of honor, decided that a noble gesture would be appreciated. It was a fatal mistake based on a misunderstanding of another culture and the rules of the game. As soon as the last arquebus was piled up, the attitude of the locals changed instantly. The masks of goodwill were dropped, and the Portuguese realized that they had deprived themselves of their only advantage. Without weapons, they went from being a dangerous force to a defenseless crowd, easy prey for anyone who wanted them. The tribe immediately began to rob the survivors, taking their remaining clothes, jewelry, and supplies. Resistance was futile. Unarmed, exhausted people could not stand up to warriors with spears. It was not just robbery, it was total humiliation. The Portuguese were separated, scattered, and deprived of their last shred of hope. The promised guides disappeared, leaving them in an even more remote area than before. Captain de Souza watched the events unfold with horror, realizing that it was his order that had led to this disaster. He wanted to buy safety with weapons, but instead he bought destruction. This betrayal finally broke the spirit of the expedition. People cried not so much from the loss of their belongings as from the realization of their complete helplessness. They had gone through storms, hunger, and the desert only to be deceived and robbed. Faith in justice and the honest word died that day, along with any hope of salvation. This episode was a turning point, after which the final act of the tragedy began. There was no longer an organized group, only scattered individuals doomed to death. In the next chapter, you will learn how the fall can become even deeper when a person is deprived not only of life, but also of dignity. Left without weapons or supplies, the group faced their final and most brutal test, the complete deprivation of everything that connected them to the civilized world. Seeing the defenselessness of the foreigners, the locals began to take their clothes. For people of the 16th century, where clothing was a marker of status and honor, this was a blow that crushed their psyche once and for all. Noble ladies and noble duns found themselves naked under the scorching sun, deprived of even a scrap of cloth to cover their nakedness. It was not just physical discomfort, it was the destruction of their personalities. Leonor de Sá, the captain's wife, could not bear this shame. She dug a hole in the sand and buried herself up to her shoulders, letting her hair down to hide from the gaze of those around her. She refused to come out, preferring immobility and death to public humiliation. Her husband and slaves tried to persuade her to get up, but her will was broken. The other survivors wandered around in a state of complete apathy, turned into living shadows. The sun mercilessly burned their unprotected skin. Insects bit their bodies, but the physical pain had already dulled. Only a deep, black melancholy and shame remained. The shame was so strong that people avoided looking each other in the eye. They had lost their human form not only externally, but also internally. Social ties had broken down completely. Now everyone was on their own, in their own personal hell. Captain de Souza, seeing his wife suffering and his inability to protect her, began to lose his mind. He wandered around, trying to find some food or clothing, but returned empty-handed. His nobility, his strength, his status, everything crumbled to dust. During those days, the last remnants of hope died. People simply lay down on the ground and waited for the end, not even having the strength to swat away the flies. Silence hung over the camp, broken only by the breath of the ocean. It was rock bottom, absolute zero, where a person ceases to be human. The story of San Juan became a parable about the fragility of civilization. Leonor never rose from her sandy shelter, becoming a symbol of tragic pride. Leonor's death was the final blow for Manuel de Souza. Having lost the woman who had kept him going all these weeks, he finally lost touch with reality. His mind, tormented by guilt and grief, became clouded. He buried his wife there in the sand, not even having the strength to put up a cross. After that, he simply got up and walked away into the thicket, without saying a word to anyone. He walked without looking where he was going, driven by the desire to disappear, to dissolve into this hostile landscape. No one tried to stop him. The survivors had no strength left, and the captain himself had no purpose. He disappeared into the African wilderness, and no one ever found out where or how he met his death. His departure marked the definitive end of the expedition as a whole. Without a leader, albeit a broken one, the group fell apart into separate atoms. People simply scattered, looking for water or shade. The fate of Manuel de Souza is the tragedy of a man who took responsibility for hundreds of lives and failed to save them. The burden of guilt proved heavier than any cargo in the galleon's hold. Without a commander, the people were doomed. They died one by one, quietly and unnoticed, becoming part of the landscape. Nature finished what the storm had started. The captain's story became a legend, passed down by word of mouth. The tale of his madness and disappearance into nowhere frightened sailors for many decades to come. It was the end of a man who had everything and lost everything. His life became the price paid for the Empire's ambitions. The silent jungle swallowed his secret forever. Of the more than 500 people who stepped ashore after the shipwreck, only a few made it to the Portuguese outpost. According to various sources, between 8 and 20 people survived. They were not the richest or most noble, but the most resilient and lucky. Among the survivors were several slaves who were better than others at finding food and navigating. Their skills, which were not valued in everyday life, became the key to their salvation here. It was ironic that those at the bottom of the social ladder found themselves at the top of the pyramid of survival. Their journey took many months. They fed on roots, crabs, and dead animals. They walked when it was impossible to walk and crawled when their legs gave out. Rescue came by chance. They were picked up by a passing merchant ship that noticed signals from the shore. When they were brought on board, the sailors could hardly recognize these creatures as human beings. They looked like ghosts, blackened by the sun and emaciated to the extreme. Their stories about the fate of the San Juan shocked their listeners. No one could believe that such a powerful expedition could disappear so ingloriously. The survivors brought with them not gold and spices, but the terrible truth about the price of colonial ambitions. Their testimonies formed the basis of chronicles that were read throughout Europe. These few people became a living reminder that the sea belongs to no one. Their rescue was a miracle, an exception to the rule. They returned to the world of the living, but part of their souls remained on that shore forever.
We tell this story so their sacrifice is not forgotten in the waves.
The story of the San Juan was not forgotten. It entered Portuguese literature and culture as a symbol of tragic maritime history. The great poet Luís de Camões mentioned the disaster in his epic poem Os Lusíadas, immortalizing the names of Manuel de Sousa and Leonor. This tragedy forced the maritime authorities to revise the rules for loading ships, although the greed of merchants continued to prevail over safety for a long time. The shipwreck revealed the vulnerability of an empire stretched across thousands of miles of ocean. The site of the wreck became a kind of monument to human pride. For a long time, the waves washed fragments of Chinese porcelain ashore, silent witnesses to former luxury. The story became a warning to future generations of sailors. It taught humility in the face of the forces of nature and the importance of making the right decisions at critical moments. Today, this story reminds us that technology and wealth do not guarantee survival. Man's main resource remains his spirit and ability to remain human. The San Juan disappeared, but its ghost continues to sail through the centuries. It is a lesson written in the sand that even the tide of time cannot wash away. We have come a long way in the footsteps of the San Juan expedition, from the glitter of gold to complete nakedness and despair. This story is a stark reminder of how thin the line is between civilization and savagery, between triumph and tragedy. 500 lives, enormous wealth, and the ambitions of an entire empire were reduced to dust due to a series of mistakes and a fatal combination of circumstances. They defeated the storm, but lost to their own weaknesses and the cruelty of a world for which they were not prepared. What did you find most frightening in the story? The mercilessness of nature, or how quickly people lose their humanity in extreme conditions? Write your opinion in the comments, suggest a topic for the next investigation, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. See you in new stories.